Good evening. My name is Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story, the digital platform that has relentlessly focused on the COVID pandemic, bringing you reports and voices from the ground. The government says the second wave is stabilizing. So, in the next phase, our focus will be on the economy. The opposition is lashing out at the government for spiraling fuel prices of petrol and diesel. The government is conceding that these deregulated prices, and they differ from state to state because the tax imposed, are a matter of pain to the ordinary citizen, but are pointing to it being a difficult time because of the pandemic and because of a slew of welfare measures that have been taken as a way to offset the suffering. But these remarks from Oil Minister Dharmendra Pradhan have created a controversy of their very own. Listen in.
राहुल गांधी जी पहले जवाब दे, उनकी शासित महाराष्ट्र में क्यों महंगा है तेल, राजस्थान में क्यों महंगा है तेल, पंजाब में क्यों महंगा है तेल। देखो, ऐसे गैर जिम्मेवार बयान राहुल गांधी ही दे सकते हैं। आज मैं स्वीकार करता हूं, आज की जो प्राइस आई है ये नागरिकों को, कंज्यूमर को दिक्कत दे रहा है, इसमें कोई दो राय नहीं है। लेकिन भारत सरकार हो या राज्य सरकार है, कोरोना में लगभग 35,000 करोड़ से ज्यादा एक साल के अंदर टीका में खर्चा हो रहा है। अभी 1 लाख करोड़ रुपया खर्चा करके प्रधानमंत्री जी ने 8 महीने के लिए मुफ्त में खाद्यान्न देने के लिए प्रधानमंत्री गरीब कल्याण योजना शुरू की है। पीएम किसान में हजारों करोड़ रुपया देश के किसानों को सीधा बैंक खाता में पहुंचाया गया है। मैं इसी साल की बात कर रहा हूं। अभी किसानों की हित को ध्यान में रखते हुए चावल और गेहूं की एमएसपी घोषणा की गई। ये सारे खर्चा अभी, और उसके अलावा देश में रोजगार सृजन के लिए, डेवलपमेंट काम होने के लिए इन्वेस्टमेंट की आवश्यकता हो रही है। इस कष्ट के समय में हम पैसा बचा के लोक कल्याण काम पे लगाएं। अगर राहुल गांधी जी को इतनी गरीबों के प्रति दर्द है, चिंता है, वो अपने मुख्यमंत्री उद्धव ठाकरे जी को आदेश दें। आज मुंबई में सबसे महंगा इसीलिए है कि महाराष्ट्र की टैक्स देश के अंदर सबसे ज्यादा है, राजस्थान की टैक्स पेट्रोल के ऊपर देश के अंदर सबसे महंगा है, वहां पहले घटाएं।
So, as the opposition protests on the streets, the oil minister says opposition states can slash those taxes if it feels so strongly about the issue. But the more interesting part of those comments was Mr. Pradhan's reference to a slew of welfare measures, including the vaccination rollout, the 35,000 crores, for which, by the way, was committed well before the second wave by the finance minister while presenting the union budget. To look at the economic and political implications of those comments, let me introduce our panel on the program today. We're joined by Professor Arun Kumar. Let's welcome him to the program. Well-known economist and author. We're joined by Yamini Aiyar, the president of Center for Policy Research. We're also joined by Mr. Gopal Agarwal, a senior leader of the BJP. I'll start with you, Gopalji, if I may. How do we make sense of these remarks? क्योंकि एक तरफ प्रधान जी की बात बिल्कुल ठीक है that prices vary from state to state. In fact, the state of Rajasthan, which is ruled by the Congress, has among the highest VAT on petrol and diesel that we know of. तो ये बात तो ठीक है, but to point to welfare measures, to point to vaccination schemes, to sort of suggest that this is the reason why the government cannot intervene on fuel prices, how do you see these remarks? आप उनको किस नजरिए से देखते हैं?
देखिए, अगर इसको गहराई से समझना है और इकोनॉमिक इसके इम्प्लीकेशंस और पैरामीटर्स को समझना है और पॉलिटिकल साइड को एक बार साइड में रख के अगर हम बात करें, तो सरकार को रेवेन्यू की आवश्यकता होती है। जो वेलफेयर स्कीम्स हैं सरकार की, पेंडेमिक में उसकी आवश्यकता बहुत ज़्यादा पड़ गई है। सरकार का खर्चा एक तरफ काफ़ी बढ़ गया है और जो सरकार का रेवेन्यू है, डायरेक्ट और इनडायरेक्ट कलेक्शंस है टैक्सेस का, वह काफ़ी कम हो गया है। और जीएसटी के अंतर्गत भी देखें तो क्या है कि जो इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स का है, जीएसटी का कंपेंसेशन सेंटर ने स्टेट्स को देना है, उसके अंदर भी ये एग्रीमेंट था कि चाहे सेंटर के पास टैक्स कलेक्शन कम हो, लेकिन स्टेट्स को 14% के हिसाब से हर साल एवरेज इंक्रीमेंट के हिसाब से उनको कंपेंसेट करना पड़ेगा। अब अर्थव्यवस्था की स्थिति को यह देख के स्पष्ट है कि सरकार को टैक्स कलेक्ट करना है। अब यह चॉइस है सरकार के पास, एक्स आइटम से खरीद टैक्स कलेक्ट करे या कहाँ से करे। तो सरकार ने डायरेक्ट टैक्स भी कम किया है। जीएसटी के अंतर्गत इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स भी जो लगभग 25 से 30% था बिफोर जीएसटी, वह
जी।
अब जीएसटी के अंतर्गत मैक्सिमम आइटम्स में 18% है और 6 आइटम्स में केवल 28% है। और जो कॉर्पोरेट टैक्स है और जो डायरेक्ट टैक्स है उसमें भी सरकार ने कमी की है। तो रेट्स में कम किया है और इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटी पेंडेमिक के कारण बहुत कम हो गई है, उसके कारण और कलेक्शन कम हो गई है। तो सरकार का ओवरऑल टैक्स कलेक्शन कम हुआ है, खर्चा बढ़ा है। अब ये हमारा चॉइस है। देखिए, कोई भी कह सकता है कि आप पेट्रोल डीजल पे टैक्स ले रहे हो, मत लो, किसी और पे ले लो। तो यह सरकार का वैल्यूड और बैलेंस डिसीजन है कि पेट्रोल डीजल पे अभी हम टैक्स ले लेते हैं ताकि सरकार के रेवेन्यू की जो शॉर्टेज है वह पूरी हो। ये तो केंद्र की स्थिति है। लेकिन प्रदेश सरकार के बारे में जब हम बात करते हैं तो ये कहते हैं कि जब केंद्र सरकार उनको इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स के अंदर कंपेंसेट कर रहा है, पूरी तरह से शॉर्टेज को भी कंपेंसेट कर रहा है, केंद्र अपने टैक्स कलेक्शन में भी प्रदेशों को 42% के करीब फाइनेंस कमीशन के अंतर्गत टैक्स उनको दे रहा है, बोरोइंग की अलाउ कर रहा है। ज़्यादातर सोशल वेलफेयर की स्कीम पेंडेमिक में केंद्र सरकार अपने ऊपर उसकी जिम्मेदारी खर्च की ले रहा है, चाहे वैक्सीनेशन की हो और इक्विपमेंट की हो। तो फिर स्टेट्स के पास स्कोप है कि वह अपना टैक्स पेट्रोलियम प्रोडक्ट में कम कर दे वैट के रूप में। यह बात है, यह स्थिति यह है कि सरकार अपना टैक्स कलेक्शन कर रही है ऑल्टरनेटिव के लिए इसमें से, लेकिन प्रदेशों को हम कह रहे हैं कि आप कम कर लीजिए क्योंकि केंद्र सरकार आपको कंपेंसेट कर रही है। और ये
ठीक है।
अर्थव्यवस्था की आवश्यकता भी है। अगर इस वक्त हम रिसोर्स जनरेट नहीं करेंगे तो इकोनॉमी के लिए जो 21 लाख करोड़ का एक हमने आत्मनिर्भर पैकेज अनाउंस किया है, या जो सोशल वेलफेयर स्कीम्स को जो अभी आपने धर्मेंद्र प्रधान जी के जो अब स्टेटमेंट दिया उसमें उन्हें 2-3 बोला, उसके अलावा भी बहुत सारी स्कीम्स हैं। 82,000 करोड़ का पीएम किसान सम्मान निधि में दे रहे हैं, ग्रामीण रोड्स कंस्ट्रक्शन में तो हो ही रहा है, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में भी हो रहा है, फिर उज्ज्वला गैस योजना, ऐसे बहुत सारे स्कीम्स हैं जिसके अंतर्गत प्रधानमंत्री आवास
पर
योजना
मैं आपसे एक सवाल पूछना चाहूंगी, देन आई विल ओपन इट अप। डू यू नॉट थिंक कि ये एक तरह से पॉलिटिकली लोडेड फैसला है? क्योंकि इन द पास्ट व्हेनेवर कांग्रेस लेड गवर्नमेंट्स रिफ्यूज टू इंटरवीन इन डीरेगुलेटेड डीजल एंड पेट्रोल प्राइसेस, तब बीजेपी काफी शोर मचाती थी। तो ऐसा लगता है एक रोल रिवर्सल हो गया है, गोपाल जी।
No, it cannot be said like this because the pandemic situation was not there earlier. At present, the revenue has gone down drastically. From the even the budgeted estimate for last year, today the report has come out that we have increased our direct tax collection. But ultimately, if you look for the last year and last 1.5 year, the tax collection has come down drastically. This was the not situation earlier, and the expenditure has grown up manifold. So, and the government has to come out with this fiscal stimulus packages also. So that situation, comparing current pandemic situation with earlier situation directly is not feasible. I think there is a big difference in the ecosystem which was present earlier time
Okay,
when we
fair enough.
demand prices should come down, and the current scenario is a quite different scenario.
Okay, fair enough. That the pandemic has changed, in a sense, the rule book. Yamini Aiyar, what quarrel can there be with that? That's happening across the world. That the COVID pandemic cannot apply the same rules as before. And the big question, of course, for economists and public policy framers is whether the government should, in fact, intervene. The government is arguing that the states are free to reduce taxes. There's no bar on them doing it. And in fact, the opposition is being hypocritical because some of the opposition-led states, and this we know to be true, have among the highest tax slabs on oil and fuel that we know of.
I think, Barkha, it's important to sort of take the politics out of this and just for the moment, just take a view on the crisis in and of itself, right? There's no argument that the pandemic has led to extreme economic distress, and the imperative now is on the government to spend because there is an urgent need for stimulus, both in terms of relief for the economically distressed, particularly the lower bottom half of the bottom end of the pyramid, as well as to stimulate the economy to get back into action so that we can have can move towards a recovery cycle. The question is, have we done? Where should the money come from? And governments across the globe have struggled with this question and actually broken long-held assumptions about fiscal austerity over the course of the last year and provided extremely generous stimulus packages. If you look at America and the UK as two important examples of the extent of stimulus, quite unheard of in the past. The IMF too has stopped talking about austerity and started talking about cash transfers to the poor. The grammar of macroeconomics has shifted quite dramatically over this last year and a half, entirely in response to the challenge of the pandemic. But the Indian government, on the other hand, has been far more conservative. If we look at last year, our overall fiscal stimulus, not monetary stimulus, fiscal stimulus, i.e. additional government expenditure, was the lowest compared to any other comparable country. And importantly, the economic distress that we experienced was significantly sharper compared to any other comparable country. So we relied far more on monetary stimulus than we did fiscal spending. Spending was limited to the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, which was largely for food and for Narega expansion. And if you look actually at last year's budget, a significant proportion of the expanded expenditure from last year came from taking off-budget expenditures for food back into the budget, which was an important and positive transparency measure, but not an indication of expanded government expenditure. The government did budget for vaccinations in the FY21 budget, but didn't budget for expanded relief or any other stimulus for this current year, just as the second surge hit. What the government did do in 2019 was to reduce corporate taxes. What the government didn't do in 2020 was to look for alternative measures of providing us fiscal stimulus and lived within its means, so to speak, despite the fact that the economic distress was quite significant. So the argument today that we need to increase fuel taxes on fuel prices in order to be able to provide for welfare schemes doesn't really add up. Because in FY20, the only expansion we've had thus far is of the ration through the Pradhan Mantri Garib Anna Yojana scheme, which is expanding ration the entitlement through to November. There hasn't been any announcement of any other package. The Narega scheme is, of course, expanding, yet we know from data coming from the ground that demand for Narega is far higher than supply currently. So it's unclear what the excess money is going for, number one. But the larger point is, in a moment at a time of extreme distress, in the context of pandemic, when government spending has to increase, where and how should the government find the money to spend? Should it find the money through taxation of indirect taxation of this nature, which affects prices and affects the poor, or should it find the money from other means? And we can talk about that as the conversation goes.
So if I had to summarize you in a simple layperson's way, the government needs to be spending a lot more than it has. There is no evidence that the economy has actually been stimulated, and that would be the only available stimulus right now, given consumer sentiment is down, given no one else is ready to spend. So it's not clear where the government is spending. So when Mr. Pradhan says this, it doesn't add up for you. You haven't actually said, therefore, whether you think that the government should be spending to slash these prices. You haven't answered that.
May I say, two very important things. One is that it's important to remember that the bulk of the expenditure responsibility rests with states. All right. And over time, the government of India has tended to hold on to a lot of the resources because it has the largest taxation powers. All right. One of the consistent stories of government of India across political parties, getting a little sharper in the last few years pre-pandemic, is that the government of India has consistently budgeted such that its expected revenue from direct taxes and indirect taxes is significantly higher than its actual fuel taxes. So there has been revenue shortfall and its disinvestment targets have failed. Pre-pandemic revenue shortfall was 0.7 GDP. How has Government of India managed to then continue to spend? It has done so by squeezing revenue from states. One of the big points of contestation between the center and states has actually been in petrol and diesel taxes, where the government has basically moved excise duties into cess, amounting to about 50,000 crores since 2014, which means that the central government has been able to hold on to more money, leaving states with relatively lesser resources than states should have got. And therefore, one of the reasons why states are having to tax on petrol is also because
make up for that shortfall.
revenue.
Okay. Before I go to Arun Kumar, Gopal Agarwal, if you'd like a brief interjection there, because the argument ki states ko karna chahiye. Yamini Aiyar making the argument that the center needs to spend a lot more, and the states are already feeling squeezed. So unke paas bhi shortfall hai. Unko bhi ye tax slab increase karke rakhna padega because they need to make up for the shortfall.
I would like to just mention here one or 2 points briefly, because we have two economists and I am also a student of economics and also a chartered accountant. Also, I know accounts also. Budget is basically an accounting principle. And what I said is that economic decisions are just making choices. That's what Dharmendra Pradhanji is telling. We are saying that already fiscal deficit is very high, 9.5%. And the debt to GDP ratio is almost 90%. So and the government has to meet its expenditure. It is not only for welfare scheme but also for administrative expenditure, other expenditure. It's a whole budget of almost 35 lakh crores. So that has to be met. So we have a choice whether to collect tax from direct taxes or other items or a GST or from petrol. The government has taken a conscious decision at this point of time to continue to collect taxes from the petrol and diesels. Ultimately, if we do not collect it from here, we have to collect it from other sources.
From somewhere else. Yeah.
And I'm simplifying it, and we have no scope for further increasing the fiscal deficit, because we can definitely, some people are saying print money, that will increase the deficit, it will increase the inflation, it will be counterproductive for the poor. So it's a conscious decision by the government that we will not increase more fiscal deficit, try to restrict it to 9.5% and not borrow more than 90% and do not reduce the
Fair
expenditure.
enough.
And last point I would also mention is that in the last budget, Nirmala ji, what we did is, with finance minister, is we could have done a jugglery of accounts also. Put many expenditure, like under previous UPA government, put many expenditure off budget. We have tried to bring every expenditure into the budget figures, and we have tried to reduce the use the method of keeping expenditure out of the budget, like oil bonds, etc. We could have issued an oil bond and other thing.
So,
And then
yeah. I think your last point I'll take to Arun Kumar. In fact, I remember on the day of the budget, one of the points that Yamini made was that the government should be complimented for not trying to fudge the deficit figures. I think everybody said that it's a good thing that there was transparency about the increased fiscal deficit. So that point is certainly taken. But Arun Kumar, that last point Mr. Agarwal made is an interesting point. Uday Kotak is among industrial leaders who said it's time for the government to print more money. You're hearing Mr. Agarwal argue that would in fact only increase the deficit. It would be counterproductive to the economy. The economy has been ravaged by the pandemic, as economies all over the world have. The states have the option to reduce the VAT, and that might be the best way to go on these increasing fuel prices. Your take?
So, as Gopal Agarwal has already said, that there are different ways of raising funds for expenditure. And Yamini has also said that we need to increase expenditures as a stimulus because people are suffering. There's a lot of unemployment, and there's also a lot of income loss that people have suffered. So the question is where to raise resources. What would be the optimal way of doing that? First thing is indirect taxes tend to be regressive, and they also tend to be inflationary. Now, in a situation where people have lost incomes, if you create inflation, then demand would be affected and the growth of the economy would therefore suffer as a result of this. So therefore, if you try and raise resources through indirect taxes, that would be counterproductive to the idea of giving a stimulus to the economy, to stimulating demand by the people, because people have lost income, people have lost employment. So therefore, indirect taxes is the wrong way to go about it. Secondly, when you raise indirect taxes on a basic item like petroleum goods, then all prices rise because it is used for everything. It's used for transportation. For instance, wheat does not have a GST, but because you've raised prices of petroleum goods, transportation of wheat becomes more expensive, and therefore it also bears a tax. So even those items which don't have a tax tend to rise because of this. So there's a general inflationary tendency that takes place, which is counterproductive for us. Therefore, going for indirect taxes is not the right way of doing it. Secondly, when the money goes into the budget, you can't say it is for this or that purpose unless it's a cess specifically meant for some purpose. So, for instance, if you have a cess for road, then it'll go for road building. If you have something for education, it might go for education, but even that has not happened quite well in our context. So the money that's going, as Gopal said, is it's an accounting sense. So you can take money from wherever and spend it wherever you like. So it's not as if, when you've taken money from, say, petroleum goods, you're spending it specifically on the, relief for the pandemic.
Pandemic, yeah.
So therefore, it's not as if, it's one-to-one. It's not that.
But what would you have them do? What would you have them do?
Yeah, I'm coming to that. I'm coming to that. So therefore, the direct taxes are a better way of raising resources. But we've been cutting back on direct taxes. We cut back in 2019 on corporation tax, and that led to a decline in the collection of direct taxes. And therefore, you become more dependent on the indirect taxes. But of course, you can't raise it immediately. You can't, suppose you go for wealth taxation, you can't get wealth taxation done immediately. Or if you increase income tax, it'll come only after a lag. So what else can you do? You can borrow. The banks are flush with funds because you see the entire Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme of 22 lakhs crores. Of that, 9 lakh crore was coming from the RBI. There was other credit, etc. coming. Only about 3 lakh crore going as direct aid for the poor people. Now that package, which was more a stimulation of credit and demand, etc. Okay, that has not worked. And the reason is that if demand is down, then people will not borrow. And that's why last year the RBI was complaining that 8 lakh crore was being deposited with the RBI at reverse repo. Now, instead of RBI said, why don't you lend it out? And the banks were saying there's not enough demand for credit because investment is down, production is down. Now, this year, I heard a little while back that about 4 lakh crore is surplus with the banks, which they're depositing, with the RBI. Now, if you had a COVID bond, you could borrow that 4 lakh crore. And therefore, at the moment, what you need to do is bring down the taxes on petroleum goods by about 2.5 lakh crore. Yeah, you could borrow 4 lakh crore, and that would not be a problem.
Can I interject to understand the contours of this COVID bond? Because it's an interesting proposal, and I want to take it to both Gopal Agarwal and Yamini Aiyar. So you're essentially saying the government should take a loan, it should borrow from the surplus sort of liquidity that is available in banks. No other sector is going to borrow at this point, so it may as well be the government instead of putting the burden on the citizen. Am I summarizing? I'm not an economist or a chartered accountant, so I tend to paraphrase in very non-economist language. Please tell me if I've summarized you correctly, Mr. Kumar.
Yes. So meaning those are funds available.
Sure.
And at the moment, those funds are being deposited with the RBI to earn a reverse repo. Instead, the government could offer a little bit more than the reverse repo, and that those funds could be borrowed. Then in the stock market, people have made a lot of money. There also, there's a possibility of borrowing using COVID bonds. So therefore, it's not as if you can't do anything. Of course, the fiscal deficit will rise. There's no doubt about that. But our fiscal deficit at 6.3% slated for the budget this year, can easily rise to 9% or 10% without there being too much problem. And of course, I'm not saying that we go to the extent which the US has done, where it went in for a $2 trillion stimulus, then a $900 billion stimulus, and then when Biden came, $1.9 trillion, and now they're talking about a $6 trillion expenditure.
Sure.
So I'm not saying we go that route and we raise it to 20-25%, because already with 6.3 plus the states plus the public sector, your fiscal deficit would be about 13% or so.
Let me take your idea. Got it. Let me take your idea to both Yamini and Gopalji. Two ideas that I'm hearing there: a COVID bond that borrows from the banks, that also leverages the markets that have almost existed in a parallel universe, and a hint there at a wealth tax. The Thomas Piketty idea kind of returns. Yamini, I'll get your response, and then I'll take it to Mr. Gopal Agarwal.
So I completely agree with the arguments that Professor Kumar made. I think it is important to recognize that any indirect taxation is regressive, and it is quite the opposite of what needs to be done at a time like this. I think that it's important to also remember, if we look at the recovery that the Indian economy experienced over from September through till the second wave, September of last year through till the second wave, that recovery was clearly K-shaped. The stock markets were booming as unemployment was rising, and that itself gives you enough of a case for introducing a wealth tax. I think the budget of FY21 was a missed opportunity. I think we talked about it on your show. In fact, at the time, the idea of a COVID bond was floated back in March 2020 or April 2020. I think it's a really it is exactly the way to go, and those are proposals that we should be taking quite seriously. There's a third one that I think that can be implemented quite quickly without having to wait for the complexities of something like a welfare tax, which is that the government of India and state governments have a long history of inefficient expenditure. There is large amounts of unspent balances that sit in bank accounts across the country. One CAG report pointed this to be about 1.75 lakh crores. There are multiple proposals, easy to implement proposals on the table for what is needed to do to sweep that money and repurpose it for welfare schemes. A lot of this unspent money is in fact for welfare programs. So expenditure efficiency and effective expenditure switching can get us to have the resources that we need to at least do the bare minimum welfare implementation that we need. One last point though, it's important to remember in this conversation that right now, all the taxation that is being talked about is taxation for business as usual, as was supposedly budgeted in the budget that of March that was to be implemented from April 1st of 2021. We still do not have from the Ministry of Finance a clear indication of how the ministry has interpreted the economic impact of the last 2-3 months. We know from RBI, we know from private sector downgrading of our GDP, but we don't know from the ministry. We don't have a good enough estimate from the ministry of what they see as the impact on revenue shortfalls in the country. And without a clear vision of understanding of what has happened from the ministry's perspective and vision of what needs to be done going forward, ad hoc things like justifying increases in taxes of petrol and diesel are exactly the wrong way to address the economic crisis that we confront.
But neither of you have addressed, and I'll come to that in my final comments. And when I say neither of you, I mean Professor Kumar and Ms. Aiyar on the fact that states, Yamini, you alluded to the fact that states are feeling squeezed on the taxes, so maybe they can't compensate for the citizen, and it has to come from the center. Gopal Agarwal, the two ideas of COVID bond and a wealth tax, also Yamini's proposal that you know there's a lot of wastage in government utilization of funds. I want you to respond to all three ideas.
These are important suggestions. As Barkha ji, I told that government is open to many suggestions, etc. We are going to, it's a work in progress, and as the economy progress, we definitely would look into various options. Ultimately, economic decisions are exploring various options and testing and then choosing one of the options. So, but I have certain reservations on these two issues. One thing is, as I told you, that already there is a very high level of debt to GDP ratio, government, state as well as center. The debt component is very high. So that is one issue that the government considers. Then in the bank also there is a risk aversion. The RBI has also pointed out that due to COVID, there will be a very strong pressure on the stressed assets, on the banks also. Many repayment, loan, etc. All these issues are very much on the mind of the government, and on the so any form of borrowing, there can be multiple forms of borrowing. Still, government can without even issuing bond, government can simply borrow because RBI has given this leverage for the states and center. Everybody can borrow, so that is not the thing. And the second, on the wealth tax, I have certain reservations. Because India is an economy where saving is an important part of capital creation, and a wealth tax, charging wealth tax is sometimes considered to be on a negative impact on the saving side. So this is one issue, but definitely it can be looked. But at present, wealth tax is not what we are looking at. But any kind of borrowing, there can be ultimately, if the government requires funds, there can be multiple ways. What I for Yamini ji, what I would like to tell you is, government finance ministry is also coming out with a monthly economic monitoring report, which gives what is the scope that they think the economy is performing, how it will is doing. Every month we are coming out with a report. What we believe is that the effort of the government on the expenditure, it is not only the welfare that we are right to center. BJP considers business community industries also very important for the growth of development of the country, and it is not only the welfare of and putting money into the poor, that is not only the only purpose of budget exercise or expenditure from the government. We have to spend for recycle growth stimulus for the industries. So we have come out with very attractive production linked PLI schemes, and
Yeah.
we hope that the economic recovery cycle will itself create an increase in direct and indirect tax mop up, which we have seen in the GST, that for the last 6 months continuously our collection in GST has become more than 1 lakh. And even today, no, just let me finish. I'll just finish it. Today also, direct tax collection mop-up has come out, increased by 85%. So what we think is, we should focus on the economic recovery, stimulus, give stimulus to the industries, provide liquidity, and create demand to the government expenditure on infrastructure and other expenditure, and also support for the export business, defense industry. Like this, the economic cycle will move, and that will create more
Okay.
resources. At that time, we will have ample scope for
Let me jump.
petrol and other taxes that can be
Got your
done.
point. Okay, I actually hear your argument that in a way a wealth tax at this point would actually deflate an already ravaged consumer sentiment, an already ravaged market sentiment. Arun Kumar, do respond. We have a couple of minutes left on the show, so go
Yeah.
ahead.
So very quickly, since many points have been raised, the first is that the states are short of resources far more than the center, a point that Yamini has already made, and therefore the cut, of taxes by the states is going to be far more difficult than by the center. It has to be initiated by the center. That's the first point. Second is, I didn't say wealth taxation. I said in the stock market, a lot of capital gains have taken place. We can tax the capital gains, in the stock market, because implementing wealth tax will take time. It will not be immediate. So it'll not give you funds immediately. So therefore, my point is slightly different. The
Okay.
third point is that wealth taxation will not impact savings. What impacts savings is the investment in the economy. The investment rate in the economy has dropped very sharply in the last 1 year, but it's been dropping since 2012-13 when it had peaked. So if we raise the investment rate, saving would automatically get generated in the economy. So it's not by wealth taxation. Wealth taxation will have no effect on the savings as long as investment takes place. So it's the investment that has to be boosted. And for that, what do we need to do? Immediately create demand. What we are doing is long term. So it's like saying, if my house is burning today and somebody comes and says, I'm going to buy more fire tender and I'm going to set up a fire station near your house, by then my house would burn. So what we need to do is short-term demand generation. When the demand comes back on, then capacity utilization will rise, and then only with the investment rise. So it's like saying that I can take the horse to water, but the horse may not drink the water. So as long as demand remains short, that's the problem. So I don't think, what Gopalji is saying is right, that we are doing this, that, and the other. And that's what the problem with the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme is, that it's a supply side thing. Supply side will work provided demand is there. So we need to generate demand. And that's where I would say that today the budget needs to be reformulated. All the assumptions in the budget, when it was
Have been
presented
challenged by the second wave. Have been challenged by the second wave.
yeah,
That's an
because
important point.
resources are down, expenditures will be more, therefore the deficit is bound to rise. Now the question is, how do we raise the resources? So that's the next point. Point about debt GDP ratio that Gopalji raised. Again, India is less indebted than many other countries relative to GDP. So it's not that we cannot do it. And as many people have said, once the economy comes back bouncing, then you can cover the debt by repayment because your tax collection will rise. If you don't do something now, and it's today that you need to do something, not wait for the responses to take place over next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And finally, regarding growth, the problem with growth is we are not taking the unorganized sector into account in our calculation. So the rate of growth is far lower than what the official rate of growth is, because the unorganized sector, from where the demand is shifted to the organized sector. So organized sector may be rising, but the unorganized sector is declining, and therefore the rate of growth is far lower. And reduction of waste is absolutely important, because there are a lot of things that can be curtailed in the budget, and we need to save resources there. So Gopalji should take that, that all wasteful expenditure of various kinds, that should be immediately curtailed in the budget to get resources.
Okay, all very concrete points. Let me just jump in there. We have literally by the clock to like less than 2 minutes left, so I'll give concluding words to both Yamini, and then Mr. Gopal Agarwal can have the last word. Professor Arun Kumar is actually making a point about tax on capital gains, which I sort of generalized as wealth tax, but there is also some argument for taxing the rich to subsidize the poor. So I therefore did throw in the idea of a wealth tax into the mix. But what he said very interestingly is that the February budget cannot be applied to the situation we're in.
Absolutely, Barkha. The same argument was made last year as well, because the pandemic hit in March and the budget had just been announced, and that budget didn't apply either. All bets are off. They have been off for some time now. It's time for us to take this very seriously. I completely agree with all the points that Professor Kumar made. I just want to add two very important things related to mistakes that we made last year. The mistake that we made last year was that the central government directed the expenditure to the extent that it was willing to, and then gave states the space to borrow from the market, which is deeply problematic for reasons we don't have time to get into. I think the answer now has to be for the center to come up with a formula-based COVID-19 grant that supports states. States are better able to identify what kind of incentives and welfare programs they need to implement to deal with the realities of their states and the health infrastructure story as well. Number one. Number two, the mistake that we made in our in our economic response last year was that we assumed that we can avoid the need for relief and hit straight into economic recovery and get back onto the pathway of growth. The reality is the pandemic has told us there's many complexities in our economy itself. In fact, the unorganized sector is even more distressed today than it has been before. Formal employment has reduced, informal employment has increased, and the nature of our recovery, which was K-shaped, shows that the distress at the lower end of the economy is getting exceedingly more acute. We cannot forget that you need to first do relief before you can get onto the path of recovery and sustained growth. And even that path of recovery and sustained growth has to recognize the faults of the growth paths of the past. If you don't do that, as Professor Kumar said, the demand will not pick up, investment will not pick up, and we will not get back into a virtuous cycle. We have to spend now. Debt to GDP ratio challenges can be addressed if we can credibly demonstrate that we are spending well to improve the future of the economy.
Let me give the last word to the BJP's Gopal Agarwal. Sir, I think that the point being made here is that the government is responding to a long term, whereas there is a short term immediate intervention that is needed for the long term plan to work. And therefore, neither does Nirmala Sitharaman's February budget hold in this situation, and nor does the sort of obsession with the V-shaped recovery without relief. Relief has to precede revival or hopes for a revival.
There are definitely 2-3 challenges which we recognize. One thing is that surely the economy will recover, but it will recover with vaccination and the government expenditure on the health sector. Definitely it's an important area and it is the priority that the government has to go. But there is also a challenge that there are chances of inflation, and there is a disparity of income rising, that K-shaped recovery people call, that is also a challenge. So, and the third important challenge is about the demand. Professor Arun Kumar said about the demand. So all these challenges are there. Government is knowing that, and for demand, the government is continuing with the expenditure from the public sector. All PSUs have been asked to front load their capex expenditure. Government is on for road construction, everything. The government has increased its capital expenditure almost by 36%. So demand from the consumer is low, but the government demand is trying to compensate from there. Inflation is a challenge. RBI has also formulated that challenge. For that, we think is that at present, when the demand is low, why the inflation is a concern? That is because the supply side constraint at present due to lockdown at various
Right.
levels. So once that supply side opens up, that inflation challenge will come down. There is one other thing, and ultimately these issues of putting money into the poor sections, etc., and so that the disparity does not happen, income does not get diversified into further economy into a diversified system. Also, the government is taking care of, but basic thing that we as a right to center or believing on the business community and the industries is that we have a strong entrepreneurship skill, and if the government support that, that
Okay.
economic recovery, employment, everything has to come from the private sector also, and we need to support that along with money, whatever can be
Okay.
done.
I'll have to leave.
Cycle
Sorry.
starts, once this cycle starts, all these things will be taken care of, whatever tweaking or anything. And the last point that I would like to mention is many of the schemes which were announced in the budget and in the Atmanirbhar Bharat package have not reached to the ground as yet. They are yet in work in progress stage. So once that
Okay.
impact will come, many of the problems which are at present so apparent will all automatically will be taken care of, and if any changes are required, surely we will
we,
do that.
we'll have to leave it there. Clearly, the economic aftermath of COVID is the next stage of what we need to focus on as a country. That's hoping that the second wave has indeed stabilized. That's still a hope, because we do not know what's happening in large swaths of rural India where we have actually been traveling. There's an invisibilization process on there, so that is also a matter of some concern. But leaving it there, it's been a pleasure learning from all three of you: Yamini Aiyar, Professor Arun Kumar, and Gopal Agarwal of the BJP. Thank you, and to our audience, thank you for watching. We know that the economy is something that concerns us all, and we will keep a priority focus on it. See you tomorrow then, same time, same place. Goodbye, and see you tomorrow. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.